The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of every rustle, every creak, every breath. Abby sat on the edge of the couch in their dimly lit apartment, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee mug. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing like a hammer strike. It was 11:47 p.m., and her husband Daniel had been gone for over 4 hours. He'd left after dinner, muttering something about meeting up with his old college friends. But Abby knew better. This wasn't about friends. This was about the bloodstains she'd found on his shirt last week. The faint streaks of crimson that clung to the fabric no matter how many times she scrubbed. And then there were the hairs, long, dark strands that didn't belong to her, tangled in the fibers of his jacket. Abby had tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe he'd helped someone who was hurt. Maybe he'd gotten into a fight. But the excuses felt hollow, like paper-thin lies she told herself to keep the dread at bay. Tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her stomach churned as she stared at the door, her mind racing with possibilities. What if he was cheating on her? What if he was in trouble? What if it was something worse? The thought made her shiver. She grabbed her coat and slipped on her sneakers, her hands trembling as she tied the laces. She had to know. She had to see for herself. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in as she stepped into the cool night air. The streets were eerily empty, the glow of the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. Abby kept to the darker patches, her heart pounding as she followed the path Daniel usually took. She'd tracked his phone earlier, marking the location he'd gone to last month. It was a remote area on the outskirts of the city, near the dense woods that stretched for miles. The kind of place where no one would hear you scream. The drive felt endless, each mile stretching her nerves tighter. When she finally reached the edge of the forest, she parked her car behind a cluster of trees and stepped out, the crunch of leaves underfoot making her wince. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of smell that usually felt comforting but now felt oppressive. She pulled out her phone, the screen casting a faint glow on her face as she checked the map. He was here, somewhere in these woods. Abby moved cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. Every sound made her jump, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. She clutched her phone tightly, the light barely piercing the darkness. And then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. It was a flashlight, bobbing slowly through the trees. She crouched low, her pulse racing as she crept closer. The scene that unfolded before her made her blood run cold. Daniel was there, his back to her, digging a hole in the ground. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the gruesome sight, a young woman's lifeless body lying nearby, her face pale and ghostly in the moonlight. Abby's breath caught in her throat, a strangled sound escaping her lips. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. This wasn't cheating. This was something far worse. She watched in stunned silence as Daniel finished digging and rolled the body into the shallow grave. His movements were methodical, almost robotic, as if he'd done this 100 times before. Abby's mind reeled, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. How could she not have known? How could she have lived with this man, shared a bed with him, and not seen the monster lurking beneath the surface? Tears streamed down her face as she backed away, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. She had to get out of here. She had to call the police. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on a root and she stumbled, the sound of snapping branches echoing through the silence. Daniel's head snapped up, his flashlight sweeping the trees. Abby dropped to the ground, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She pressed herself into the dirt, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. The beam of light passed over her, inches from where she lay. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying he wouldn't see her. For what felt like an eternity, she stayed there, frozen in terror. Finally, the light moved away, and she heard the sound of dirt being shoveled again. She didn't wait. She crawled backward, inch by agonizing inch, until she was far enough to risk standing. Then she ran, her legs pumping as she fled through the trees. Branches clawed at her face and arms, but she didn't care. She had to get away. She had to. A hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her backward. Abby's scream was muffled as she was dragged into the shadows. She thrashed wildly, her nails digging into the arm that held her. "Shh!" a voice hissed in her ear. "It's me! It's me!" Abby froze, her body going limp with shock. It was Daniel. He'd seen her. He'd known she was there all along. Panic surged through her veins as she struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. He dragged her deeper into the woods, his breath hot against her ear. "You shouldn't have followed me, Abby," he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. "Now you've left me no choice." Abby's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and desperation. She had to get away. She had to survive. As they reached a clearing, she saw her chance. With a burst of adrenaline, she stomped on his foot and elbowed him in the ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She sprinted into the trees, her lungs burning as she ran blindly through the darkness. Behind her, she could hear Daniel's footsteps, his breathing heavy with rage. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around her. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she pushed herself harder, faster. She had to get to her car. She had to escape. But as she burst into the clearing where she'd parked, her heart sank. Daniel was standing right next to her car, waiting for her. Abby's mind raced as she scanned the area, her eyes landing on a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. It was her only chance. She took off down the path, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She could hear Daniel calling her name, his voice cold and mocking. "You can't run forever, Abby," he taunted. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Tears streamed down her face as she ran, her legs screaming in protest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The trail twisted and turned, the trees growing denser. And then, suddenly, she saw it, a small cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. She hesitated for a split second before darting inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The cabin was empty, the air thick with dust and decay. She barricaded the door with a heavy wooden table, her hands shaking as she pushed it into place. Outside, she could hear Daniel's footsteps, his voice growing louder as he approached. "Abby," he called, his tone sickeningly sweet. Come out, wherever you are." She pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to stifle her sobs. The door rattled as Daniel tried to force it open, his laughter sending chills down her spine. "You can't hide from me, Abby," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I'll always find you." Abby's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for a way out. There was a small window on the far wall, barely big enough to squeeze through. She moved quickly, her hands fumbling with the latch. The window creaked as she pushed it open, the sound making her cringe. She glanced back at the door, her heart pounding as she heard the table scraping against the floor. Daniel was breaking in. With a surge of desperation, she climbed through the window, her body scraping against the rough wood. She landed hard on the ground outside, pain shooting through her knees. But she didn't have time to think about it. She scrambled to her feet and took off running, the sound of Daniel's enraged screams echoing behind her. The forest seemed to blur around her as she ran, her vision tunneling. She didn't know how long she ran, only that she couldn't stop. Not until she was safe, not until she was far away from him. Finally, she burst out of the trees and onto a deserted road. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the asphalt, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please help me." The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but Abby could barely hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. She stayed on the line, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of Daniel, but he was gone. For now. When the police arrived, they found her huddled on the side of the road, her clothes torn and her face streaked with dirt and tears. She told them everything, about the bloodstains, the hairs, the bodies in the woods. They searched the area, but Daniel was nowhere to be found. He'd vanished, leaving behind only the chilling evidence of his crimes. Abby never went back to the apartment. She couldn't. Every corner of that place was tainted with memories of the man she thought she knew, the man who had lied to her, deceived her, and tried to kill her. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and tried to start over. But the nightmares followed her, haunting her sleep with visions of Daniel's cold, empty eyes. Years passed and Daniel was never caught. The case grew cold, the files gathering dust in some forgotten corner of the police station, but Abby never forgot. She couldn't, because every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear his voice, whispering in the darkness. "You can't hide from me, Abby. I'll always find you." If this story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales that blur the line between nightmare and reality. The scariest stories aren't just fiction, they're warnings. Evil hides in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to slip into your world. Stay cautious, stay aware, and remember, some stories don't end when you stop listening.
Next story.
The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes you pull your jacket tighter around your shoulders. Harper stood at the edge of her backyard, her breath visible in the dim glow of the porch light. She had always loved the quiet of the countryside, the way the stars seemed to stretch endlessly above her. But tonight, the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had started a few weeks ago, small things at first. Her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, had always been a little odd. He kept to himself, rarely seen outside his weathered, ivy-covered house. But lately, Harper had noticed strange things. Lights flickering in his windows late at night, the sound of digging coming from his backyard, and the way he would stare at her from his porch, his eyes dark and unreadable. She tried to brush it off, told herself she was being paranoid. But then she found the locket. It was a delicate thing, gold with a small emerald embedded in the center. She had stumbled upon it while taking a walk in the woods behind their houses. The chain was broken, as if it had been ripped off in a hurry. Harper had picked it up, turning it over in her hands, when she noticed the initials engraved on the back, EM. She didn't know anyone with those initials, but something about the locket felt wrong. It felt out of place. That night, she had dreamt of a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear. She was running through the woods, branches clawing at her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Harper woke up drenched in sweat. The image of the woman burned into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dream meant something, that it was connected to the locket. The next morning, Harper decided to do some digging, figuratively at least. She started with the internet, searching for any news of missing women in the area. It didn't take long to find something. A woman named Emily Matthews had disappeared 6 months ago. She had last been seen hiking in the woods near Harper's town. The description matched the woman in her dream: long brown hair, green eyes, and a gold locket with the initials EM. Harper's stomach churned. It couldn't be a coincidence. She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that there was no way Mr. Grayson could be involved. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The late night digging, the way he watched her, the locket. Harper knew she had to find out the truth. That night, she waited until the house was dark before slipping out the back door. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the yard. She moved quietly, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the fence that separated her property from Mr. Grayson's. She could see his backyard from here, the overgrown grass and the old shed that leaned precariously to one side. And then she saw it, a patch of freshly turned earth near the shed. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She had to get closer. She climbed over the fence, her hands trembling as she landed softly on the other side. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. She crept toward the shed, her eyes fixed on the patch of dirt. As she got closer, she noticed something sticking out of the ground. A pale hand, fingers curled as if reaching for something. She stifled a scream, clapping a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She had to get out of there, had to call the police. But as she turned to leave, she heard the creak of a door opening behind her. Harper froze, her blood turning to ice. She slowly turned her head, her eyes widening in horror as she saw Mr. Grayson standing in the doorway of the shed. He was holding a shovel, his face shadowed but his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made her stomach drop. "Harper," he said, his voice low and smooth. "What are you doing out here so late?" She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Mr. Grayson took a step toward her, the shovel dragging behind him. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice almost regretful. "But now that you have, I can't let you leave." Harper's survival instincts kicked in, and she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She didn't look back, didn't dare. She just ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dark. She reached the fence and scrambled over it, her hands slipping on the wet wood. She landed hard on the other side, pain shooting through her ankle, but she didn't stop. She ran toward her house, her mind racing. She had to get inside, had to lock the doors, had to call for help. But as she reached her back door, she realized with a sinking feeling that it was already open. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She pushed the door open slowly, her eyes scanning the dark kitchen. Everything seemed normal, but the air felt wrong. She stepped inside, her heart pounding as she reached for the light switch. The moment the light flicked on, she saw him, Mr. Grayson, standing in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on her. He was holding a knife, the blade glinting in the light. Harper screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as she turned and ran back out the door. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps pounding against the ground. She didn't know where she was going, just knew she had to get away. She ran into the woods, the trees closing in around her. Branches clawed at her skin, but she didn't stop. She could hear him getting closer, his breathing heavy and labored. She stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, but he was already there, his hand closing around her arm. Harper fought, kicking and screaming as he dragged her back toward the house. She could feel the cold metal of the knife against her skin, and she knew she was running out of time. She had to do something, had to think of a way out. And then she remembered the locket. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She swung it at him, the chain wrapping around his wrist. He hissed in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself to go faster. She didn't look back, didn't dare. She just ran, her mind focused on one thing: survival. She didn't stop until she reached the road, her chest heaving as she collapsed onto the asphalt. She could see headlights in the distance, and she waved her arms frantically, screaming for help. The car slowed, and a man stepped out, his face filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Harper sobbed, relief flooding through her as she realized she was safe. But as she looked back toward the woods, she knew it wasn't over. Mr. Grayson was still out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he found her. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing in the dark. Harper told them everything, her voice shaking as she described what had happened. They searched the woods, but Mr. Grayson was gone. All they found was the locket, lying in the dirt where she had dropped it. Harper knew she would never forget that night, the terror that had gripped her as she ran for her life. She moved away soon after, unable to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, she would dream of the woman in the woods, her eyes wide with fear, her hand reaching out as if to warn her. Harper would wake up drenched in sweat, the image burned into her mind. She knew she would never be truly safe, not as long as Mr. Grayson was out there. But for now, she was alive, and that was enough.
Next story.
The night was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind that makes your skin crawl even before anything happens. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the deserted highway. Abigail stood on the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, hoping for a ride. She had been walking for hours, her feet aching, her mind racing with the kind of thoughts that only come when you're alone in the dark. She had left her car at a friend's house after a party, too tired to drive, and now she was regretting that decision. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her, shivering as much from the chill as from the growing sense of unease. The first car that passed didn't even slow down, its headlights slicing through the darkness like a knife. The second car, a beat-up sedan with a dented fender, slowed to a stop a few feet ahead of her. Abigail hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been told not to hitchhike, that it was dangerous, but she was desperate. She approached the car cautiously, peering through the window at the driver. He was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap. He smiled at her, but there was something off about it, something that made her stomach twist. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. Abigail nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, thanks. I'm just trying to get back to town." The man nodded, unlocking the door. "Hop in." She slid into the passenger seat, the smell of stale cigarettes and old fast food hitting her like a wall. The man didn't say much as he pulled back onto the road, just asked her name and where she was headed. Abigail answered cautiously, keeping her answers short. She kept her eyes on the road, but she could feel his gaze on her, lingering a little too long, making her skin crawl. The drive was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Abigail kept her hand on the door handle, ready to jump out if she needed to. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the man was just being friendly, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't go away. After about 20 minutes, the man turned onto a side road, one that Abigail didn't recognize. She sat up straighter, her heart starting to race. "This isn't the way to town," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man glanced at her, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Shortcut," he said simply. Abigail's mind raced. She knew she should say something, do something, but fear had her frozen in place. The road grew darker, the trees closing in on either side, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab her. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Stop the car," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to get out." The man didn't respond, just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Abigail's hand tightened on the door handle and she yanked it, but the door was locked. She turned to the man, her fear turning to anger. "Let me out!" she shouted, pounding on the window. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "You should have thought about that before you got in the car," he said, his voice low and menacing. Abigail's heart was pounding now, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She looked around the car, searching for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes landed on the man's coffee cup in the cup holder, still half full. Without thinking, she grabbed it and threw the hot liquid in his face. The man shouted in pain, swerving the car as he tried to wipe the coffee from his eyes. Abigail took advantage of the distraction, reaching over and hitting the unlock button. She yanked the door open and threw herself out of the car, rolling onto the rough pavement. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her knees and hands, and started running. The man's shouts followed her, but she didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her ears. The trees loomed around her, their shadows twisting and shifting in the moonlight. She could hear the car behind her, the engine roaring as the man tried to catch up. Abigail's mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to get away. She stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at her face and arms, but she didn't stop. She could hear the car getting closer, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating her like a target. She ducked behind a tree, pressing herself against the rough bark, trying to make herself as small as possible. The car slowed to a stop, the engine idling as the man got out. Abigail could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel, hear his voice calling out to her, taunting her. "Come on out, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't run forever." Abigail's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling with fear. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, tears streaming down her face. She could hear him getting closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. She knew she had to move, had to keep running, but her legs felt like lead. She forced herself to take a step, then another, moving as quietly as she could. She could hear the man behind her, his breathing heavy, his footsteps getting closer. Suddenly, she tripped over a root, falling to the ground with a thud. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The man was on her, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to her feet. She screamed, thrashing against him, but he was too strong. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice breaking with fear. The man just laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You should have thought about that before you got in the car," he said again, his grip tightening on her arm. Abigail's mind raced, searching for a way out. She kicked at him, her foot connecting with his shin, and he grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She turned and ran, her legs pumping as fast as they could, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps heavy and fast, his breathing ragged. She didn't look back, just kept running, her mind focused on one thing: survival. The trees thinned out ahead, and she could see a faint light in the distance. Hope surged in her chest, and she pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort. She burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road, the light coming from a small house just a few hundred yards away. She ran towards the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs threatening to give out. She could hear the man behind her, his footsteps getting closer, but she didn't stop. She reached the house and pounded on the door, screaming for help. The door opened, and a woman stood there, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Abigail didn't have time to explain. She pushed past the woman and into the house, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it and leaned against it, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The woman stared at her, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked again. Abigail shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There's a man," she gasped. He tried to hurt me." The woman's eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed the phone, dialing 911. Abigail sank to the floor, her legs giving out, her body shaking uncontrollably. She could hear the man outside, pounding on the door, shouting for her to come out. The woman stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, her voice calm but urgent. Abigail closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of the man's voice, trying to block out the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. The police arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the night. The man tried to run, but they caught him easily, tackling him to the ground and cuffing him. Abigail watched from the window, her body still trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The officers took her statement, their faces grim as they listened to her story. They assured her that the man would be locked up, that he wouldn't be able to hurt her again. But Abigail knew that the fear would stay with her, that the memory of that night would haunt her for the rest of her life.
Next story.
It was a quiet, uneventful Tuesday night when Miley first ventured into the dark web. The kind of night where the hours stretch endlessly and boredom gnaws at the edges of your mind. She had heard whispers of the dark web from friends and online forums, a hidden underbelly of the internet where anonymity reigned and the rules of the surface web didn't apply. Curiosity, that dangerous little spark, had been flickering in her chest for weeks. And tonight, it finally caught fire. Miley sat cross-legged on her bed, her laptop glowing softly in the dim light of her bedroom. The curtains were drawn, and the only sound was the faint hum of her ceiling fan. She had downloaded the necessary software to access the dark web earlier that day, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked through the instructions. Now, as she typed in the address and waited for the connection to establish, she felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The screen flickered, and suddenly she was in. The dark web was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't some cinematic, neon-lit underworld. It was stark, utilitarian, and eerily quiet. Forums with cryptic names, marketplaces offering unthinkable goods, and links that led to places she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Miley's heart pounded as she clicked through, her curiosity driving her deeper. She told herself she was just exploring, just satisfying that itch. But deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. It was on a forum titled Whispers in the Dark that she first encountered him. His username was Shadow Walker, and his posts were unsettling. He spoke in riddles, his words dripping with a strange, almost poetic menace. Miley found herself drawn to his threads, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she debated whether to engage. Finally, against her better judgment, she sent him a private message. Just a simple hi. He responded almost immediately. "Hello, little wanderer. What brings you to the shadows?" Miley hesitated, then typed back. "Just curious. This place is different." "Different indeed," he replied. "But curiosity can be dangerous. Are you sure you're ready for what lies in the dark?" Miley laughed nervously, her fingers flying over the keys. "I think I can handle it." "We'll see," he responded. "And then tell me about yourself, little wanderer." Miley froze. She knew better than to share personal information online, especially on the dark web. But something about Shadow Walker's tone made her feel safe in a strange way, like he was testing her, but not in a malicious way. She decided to play along, keeping her answers vague. She told him she was a college student, that she lived in a small town, that she liked to read and write. He seemed intrigued, his responses growing more detailed, more personal. By the time she logged off that night, her head was spinning. She couldn't explain why, but she felt seen. Over the next few weeks, Miley found herself returning to the dark web more and more. She told herself it was just to talk to Shadow Walker to unravel the mystery of who he was. But the truth was, she was hooked. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. He told her about his life, or at least the version of it he chose to share. He claimed to be a writer, someone who thrived in the shadows, observing the world from a distance. He spoke of loneliness, of a longing for connection. Miley felt a strange kinship with him, though she couldn't quite explain why. But then things started to change. It began with small things. A package arrived at her doorstep with no return address. Inside was a book, a collection of dark, haunting poetry. The note inside read, "For my little wanderer, thought you might appreciate this." Miley's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't given Shadow Walker her address. How had he known where to send it? She confronted him about it during their next conversation. He laughed it off. "You'd be surprised what I can find out, little wanderer. Don't worry, I'm just watching over you." Miley tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. Then came the phone calls. Late at night, her phone would ring, and when she answered, there would be silence on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. She changed her number, but the calls continued. She started to feel like she was being watched, even in the safety of her own home. She would catch glimpses of movement outside her window, hear footsteps on the porch when no one was there. Paranoia began to creep in, wrapping its cold fingers around her throat. One night, after a particularly unsettling call, Miley decided to cut ties with Shadow Walker. She logged onto the dark web, her hands trembling as she typed out a message. "This has to stop. I don't know what you're playing at, but I'm done." His response was immediate. "Oh, little wanderer, you can't just walk away, not after you've stepped into the shadows." Miley's breath hitched. She slammed her laptop shut, her heart pounding. But it was too late. The damage was done. The next day, she came home to find her apartment ransacked. Her drawers were pulled out, her belongings scattered across the floor. But nothing was missing. Instead, there was something new, a single photograph pinned to her bedroom wall. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her window. She was sitting at her desk, unaware of the lens focused on her. On the back of the photo, written in bold black letters, were the words, "I'm always watching." Miley's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone and called the police, but they couldn't do much without evidence. She stayed with a friend that night, too terrified to be alone. But the next morning, she received a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide from me, little wanderer. I'll always find you." From there, the stalking escalated. Shadow Walker, or whoever he was, seemed to know her every move. He sent her pictures of herself at the grocery store, at the park, even at her friend's house. He left notes on her car, voicemails filled with eerie silence. Miley felt like she was losing her mind. She stopped going to class, stopped leaving the house. But no matter what she did, he was always one step ahead. One night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed. It was a video. With trembling hands, she opened it. The footage was grainy, but she could make out the interior of her apartment. The camera panned across the room, lingering on her bed. And then, the most chilling part, the sound of her own voice, whispering, "I'm right here." Miley screamed, throwing her phone across the room. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and barricaded herself in the bathroom, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear footsteps outside her apartment, the sound of someone trying the doorknob. She called the police, her voice shaking as she begged them to hurry. When they arrived, there was no one there, but on her doorstep was another package. Inside was a single rose, its petals black as night. The note read, "You can run, little wanderer, but you can't hide." Miley knew then that she was in over her head. She packed a bag and fled to a motel on the outskirts of town, paying in cash and using a fake name. For a few days, she thought she might be safe, but then the text started again. "You're not as clever as you think, little wanderer." The final straw came when she woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of her motel room door creaking open. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was pitch black, but she could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. She reached for the knife she kept under her pillow, her hands trembling. And then a voice, low, calm, and horrifyingly familiar. "Found you." Miley screamed, lunging at the shadowy figure with the knife, but he was faster. He disarmed her with ease, pinning her to the bed. She struggled, sobbing, but he was too strong. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You should have stayed in the shadows, little wanderer." And then everything went black. When Miley woke up, she was in a dark, unfamiliar room. The walls were bare, the air thick with the scent of mildew. She tried to move, but her hands and feet were bound. Panic surged through her as she realized where she was. A basement, or maybe a cellar. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows. She heard footsteps on the stairs and her breath caught in her throat. The door creaked open, and Shadow Walker stepped into the room. He was taller than she had imagined, his face obscured by a mask. But his eyes were the same. cold, calculating, and filled with a twisted kind of amusement. "Welcome home, little wanderer," he said, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. Miley's mind raced, searching for a way out. But as he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face, she realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. She had wandered too far into the shadows, and now she was trapped. The days, or maybe it was weeks, blurred together. Shadow Walker kept her locked in the basement, visiting her at random intervals. Sometimes he would bring her food, other times he would just watch her. He spoke to her in that same calm, chilling tone, telling her stories about his other little wanderers. Miley's mind began to fracture under the weight of her fear and isolation. She cried, she screamed, she begged, but he never let her go. One night, as she lay on the cold, hard floor, she heard a noise upstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of a door being forced open. Her heart leapt with hope. Had someone found her? She strained to listen, her breath caught in her throat. And then, footsteps, heavy, hurried, coming closer. The basement door flew open, and a figure burst into the room. It wasn't Shadow Walker. It was a man in a police uniform. Miley's eyes filled with tears as she realized she was being rescued. The officer rushed to her side, cutting her bonds and helping her to her feet. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." But as they made their way up the stairs, Miley couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, and the officer's grip on her arm was too tight. When they reached the top of the stairs, he turned to her, his face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. And that's when she saw it, the mask, hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. Miley's scream echoed through the empty house as he dragged her back into the shadows, and this time there was no one left to hear her.
Next story.
The night was unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, silvery glow over the beach, its light reflecting off the gentle waves that lapped at the shore. The air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, and the only sounds were the distant cries of seagulls and the soft rustling of the wind through the dunes. It was the kind of night that should have been peaceful. But for Hazel, it was anything but. Hazel had always loved the beach at night. There was something about the way the moonlight danced on the water, the way the shadows stretched long and dark across the sand, that made her feel alive. It was a place where she could escape from the noise and chaos of her everyday life. A place where she could just be. But tonight, as she walked along the shore with her best friend Lily, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The two girls had been inseparable since childhood, their bond forged through years of shared secrets, laughter, and tears. They had spent countless nights like this, wandering the beach, talking about everything and nothing, their voices carried away by the wind. But tonight, there was a tension in the air that neither of them could quite put their finger on. It was as if the night itself was watching them, waiting for something to happen. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Hazel asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stopped walking and turned to look at Lily, her eyes scanning the darkness behind them. Lily laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind that betrayed her own unease. "Don't be silly, Hazel. It's just us out here. Who would be watching us?" Hazel didn't answer. She couldn't explain why she felt the way she did, but the sensation was undeniable. It was as if there were eyes on her, hidden in the shadows, following her every move. She shook her head, trying to dispel the feeling, and forced a smile. "You're right, I'm probably just imagining things." But as they continued walking, the feeling only grew stronger. Hazel's heart began to race, her palms slick with sweat. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of sand and the distant glow of the moon. It wasn't until they reached the old lifeguard tower that Hazel's fears were realized. The tower was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its wooden beams weathered and warped by years of exposure to the elements. It stood at the edge of the beach, a silent sentinel overlooking the water. As they approached, Hazel noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "That's weird," Lily said, her voice tinged with unease. "I thought they locked this place up at night." Hazel didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Who could have opened it, and why? She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Maybe we should check it out," she said, her voice trembling. Lily hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Hazel and the tower. "I don't know, Hazel. What if someone's in there?" "What if someone needs help?" Hazel countered, though she wasn't entirely convinced by her own argument. Still, her curiosity, or perhaps something darker, drove her forward. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside of the tower was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Hazel fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight and casting a narrow beam of light into the darkness. The beam illuminated the interior of the tower, revealing a scene that made Hazel's blood run cold. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all of the same person, her. There were pictures of her walking to class, sitting in the park, even sleeping in her own bed. And in the center of it all, written in bold red letters, were the words, "I'm always watching." Hazel's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling with shock and horror. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "we need to go, now." But before Lily could respond, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the tower into darkness once more. Hazel spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, and fumbled for the door handle. It was locked. She turned back to Lily, her eyes wide with fear. "We're trapped!" The sound of footsteps echoed through the tower, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere above them. Hazel's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and uneven, as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. "Who's there?" Lily called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of the footsteps growing closer. Hazel's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but the tower was a maze of narrow staircases and hidden corners, and she had no idea where the sound was coming from. Suddenly, the flashlight died, plunging them into complete darkness. Hazel let out a strangled cry, her hands shaking as she tried to turn it back on. But it was no use. The battery was dead. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice, low and menacing, spoke from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here, Hazel." Hazel's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice. It was him, the man who had been following her for weeks, the one she had tried so hard to ignore. He had been watching her, stalking her, and now he had her trapped. "What do you want?" Hazel demanded, her voice shaking with fear. She could feel Lily's hand gripping hers. their fingers intertwined in a desperate attempt to find comfort in each other's presence. The man chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Hazel's spine. "I want you, Hazel. I've always wanted you, and now you're mine." Hazel's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. She knew they couldn't stay here, but the tower was a death trap, and the man was between them and the only exit. She had to do something, anything, to get them out of there. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back, just get out of here." Lily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Hazel took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, she lunged forward, shoving the man as hard as she could. He stumbled backward, caught off guard, and Hazel grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her toward the door. "Run!" Hazel screamed, her voice echoing through the tower. They burst through the door, the cool night air hitting them like a slap in the face. Hazel didn't look back, didn't dare to. She could hear the man's footsteps behind them, his breathing heavy and labored as he gave chase. They ran across the sand, their feet sinking into the soft surface with every step. Hazel's lungs burned, her legs aching with the effort, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She could hear the man gaining on them, his footsteps growing louder with every passing second. "Hazel, we're not going to make it," Lily cried, her voice filled with panic. Hazel glanced over her shoulder, her heart sinking as she saw the man closing the distance between them. He was fast, too fast. "Keep going," Hazel urged, her voice desperate. "We have to keep going." But it was no use. The man was upon them, his hand reaching out to grab Hazel's arm. She screamed, twisting away from him, but he was too strong. He yanked her backward, his grip like a vice, and she fell to the ground, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Lily turned, her eyes wide with terror, and without thinking, she launched herself at the man, clawing at his face with her nails. He roared in anger, releasing Hazel and turning his attention to Lily. Hazel scrambled to her feet, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to save her friend. But before she could do anything, the man struck Lily across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling to the ground. Hazel's heart shattered as she saw her best friend lying there, unmoving, blood trickling from her temple. "Lily!" Hazel screamed, her voice filled with anguish. She rushed to her friend's side, dropping to her knees and cradling Lily's head in her lap. "Please wake up, please." The man stood over them, his breathing heavy, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You should have stayed in the tower, Hazel," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Now you'll both pay for your disobedience." Hazel's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of fear and desperation. She knew she had to do something, but what? The man was too strong, too fast. She couldn't fight him, and she couldn't run, not without Lily. But then, as if by some miracle, Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Hazel, her gaze filled with pain and confusion. "Hazel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Run." Hazel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you." But Lily's eyes were already closing again, her body going limp in Hazel's arms. Hazel's heart broke as she realized that her best friend was gone, taken from her by the monster standing over them. The man reached down, grabbing Hazel by the arm and yanking her to her feet. She struggled against him, her fists pounding against his chest, but it was no use. He was too strong. "You're mine now, Hazel," he said, his voice filled with a twisted sense of triumph, "and no one is going to save you." Hazel's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of fear and desperation. She knew she had to do something, but what? The man was too strong, too fast. She couldn't fight him, and she couldn't run, not without Lily. But then, as if by some miracle, a voice called out from the darkness. "Hey, what's going on over there?" The man froze, his grip on Hazel tightening as he turned to look in the direction of the voice. Hazel's heart leaped with hope as she saw a figure emerging from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a flashlight in his hand. "Let her go," the man shouted, his voice filled with authority. The stalker hesitated, his eyes darting between Hazel and the newcomer. For a moment, it seemed like he might fight, but then, with a growl of frustration, he released Hazel and turned, disappearing into the darkness. Hazel collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. The man rushed to her side, dropping to his knees and placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Hazel nodded, though she was far from okay. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the night, her heart aching with the loss of her best friend. She looked up at the man, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded, his expression grim. "We need to get you out of here," he said, helping her to her feet. "Can you walk?" Hazel nodded again, though her legs felt like jelly. She leaned on the man for support as they made their way back to the parking lot, her mind still racing with thoughts of what had just happened. But as they reached the safety of the car, Hazel couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The man who had been stalking her was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity. And Hazel knew that she would never truly be safe until he was caught. As they drove away from the beach, Hazel couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at her from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of sand and the distant glow of the moon. And yet, the feeling of being watched remained, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of her mind. Hazel knew that she would never be able to escape it, not completely. The man had marked her, claimed her as his own, and no matter how far she ran, he would always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to strike. The night was still, the world holding its breath once more. But for Hazel, the nightmare was far from over. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of terror and suspense, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And remember, the shadows are always watching, the night is never as quiet as it seems, and danger can lurk where you least expect it. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and keep the lights on. Good night.